Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Melissa-Kwasny, and she's here to share with us her new book, Putting on the Dog, The Animal Origins of What We Wear. Now, Melissa is the author of 6 collection of poems that won the Poetry Society of America's 2008 Cecil Hemly Award. She's also appeared in the Boston Review, the Arcadia Project, and North America Postmodern. So let's welcome to the show, Melissa-Kwasny.
Thank you for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I know it's getting some really amazing reviews, and as an author, you have to be so excited.
I am excited, and I'm excited to talk to people about it. The more that I go around on my book tour and talking to people who are interviewing me, I always learn more, and people are really interested and excited about this topic. It seems very timely.
Well, and there's so much that your book covers, and I'd love for you to share with us, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Yes. As a poet and an essayist, which is my primary genres, I had been exploring the historical and cultural relationships forged between humans and non-human forms of nature, plants, animals, in an effort to envision ways to repair the rift that that has led us to the environmental crisis that we're living in now. And so when Trinity University Press approached me with the idea of writing a book about animals and the way and the clothing that they have provided us with throughout history, I realized that although we're more and more aware of where our food comes from and the processes that bring it to us, no one had really looked at investigating the origins and effects of our clothing in a book-length form.
Well, I find it fascinating. You have your book listed in different chapters, leather, wool, silk, feathers, and so on, that really give a very good description of the origins of this.
Yes, I want to explain to your listeners the title itself, because a lot of people don't know that phrase. Putting on the dog, it's an American expression that was used in my grandparents' generation, and it means putting on fancy clothing to go out on the town, sort of like putting on the Ritz. And in actuality, Homo sapiens have put on the dog as well as the cowhide, the sheep's wool, the duck's down, the oyster's pearl for millennia. And as you said, the book is organized around 6 animal-derived materials, each with its own chapter: leather, wool, silk, feathers, pearls, and fur. And I start out each one of those with the history of the people and the animals who have provided that material. As you say, it's really a complex topic. And when I started it, which I had a very steep learning curve, I hadn't really thought, like most people, I hadn't really thought about where my clothing comes from, whether animals or plants or chemicals. And so as I began my research, I realized that each one of these materials could really deserve a multi-volume encyclopedia about it. And there have been many, many books written on silk or fur, for instance, leather. And so I had to decide a way to do it that would be focused on my interest, which is what that reveals about the relationships, good and bad, between animals and human beings. So along with the research that I did, which was extensive, I decided that I would travel for each material. I would travel at least one place where the animals were and where the people who were working with it, whether they were hunting or farming or trapping, that I would go to at least one place and just get firsthand information. And that was actually the most illuminating for me, is talking to these people who work with the materials and work with the animals, because they have these ancient skill sets, agricultural skill sets, process artisan skill sets, that most of us have no idea about. And they were incredibly informative and generous.
Well, why don't we start with silk? Because I think a lot of people may have an understanding of where silk comes from. I'd love for you to share just some of the indigenous practices and how that kind of, how today silk is being harvested.
Okay. Silk, I think, is one of the most interesting materials, because we think of it as such a luxury product, and it really is an extravagant material, especially when we think about the different kinds of weaving and dyeing that have been introduced. There's hundreds of kinds of silk and silk weaves. And so because of that, I decided that I would go to Japan, because at one time Japan exported most of the silk and some of the finest silk in the world. And so I was able to go. Most people aren't aware that silk is made out of the spit of worms, right? We think of this really rich material, but it is basically it's the unwinding of a cocoon, of a silkworm cocoon, that has the same process as any kind of metamorphosis or life cycle of other moths and butterflies. I learned there are over 100,000 insects that spin cocoons, but only the Bombyx mori, which is China's native silkworm, spins them out of silk. And so they start with, you have a moth or a butterfly. You have a moth that lays the eggs, which then become larvae or worms, which spin a cocoon that transform the inside. The worm transforms into a pupa and then breaks into the world as a moth again. This is an ancient practice. It started in China. We don't really know how long ago, but thousands and thousands of years. And so when I was in Japan, I was able to visit a number of sericulture farms, which is what silkworm farming is called, because the seri is the stickiness in that the cocoon is woven out of. In Japan, in early days, people they raised silkworms in their attics. It was usually in a place that I visited in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo, in the mountains there, where the land wasn't very, it wasn't good for farming rice or grains, barley, things that people could make a living off of. And so they supplemented their meager farming with silkworm farming. And they would have them in their attics. And there's stories, great stories about people having so many worms in their attics. And as they got bigger and bigger and they have to be fed by hand with mulberry leaves. That's their exclusive diet. So people, mostly women, would have to pick mulberry leaves to feed the silkworms. As they got bigger and bigger, the chomping, the sounds of the chewing of the mulberry leaves got so loud that some families had to sleep outside.
Oh my gosh.
now people have the silkworms are far from their houses. And but it's amazing. I visited one farm, a small farm with just a couple that were doing it. Most of the silk now is produced in China and India, but in in the farms that I went to in Japan, which were at one time widespread all over the country, they had 45,000 worms, and they would go through a couple truckloads of mulberry leaves before they started spinning.
That's just so impressive how all this comes together and the detail and the time that it takes. It must have been just really interesting as an author going through and doing the research and being there firsthand and learning about this.
Yes, and talking to the people, the silkworm farmers, but then talking to people who everyone seemed to know a great deal about the history of it. And all the procedures, like for example, one cocoons have been bred, right? Silkworms they've been bred for so long that they couldn't make it on their own, even if we let them go. Breeding has changed them so that they couldn't really even fly from one mulberry tree to another. The worms have also been bred so that the cocoons are larger. An average cocoon, though, yields about a half a mile of silk. That's amazing.
Wow.
That the cocoon, and the process of that then is that the cocoon has to be in hot water where it starts to unravel, which is probably why we found out about the silk coming from the cocoon in the first place. It begins to unravel, and then that end of the thread has to be set spinning so it unreels itself. That still is happening even in industrial silk making. Of course, we have machines now, not spinning wheels or any of those traditional tools. It takes approximately, I learned, 9,000 cocoons to make one woman's kimono, an undergarment. 140 for a silk tie.
That is a lot, and I think most people don't even realize that.
Right. There were so many things that I think most people don't realize, because I certainly didn't realize it. But as I went around, one thing that astonished me all the time was the supply chain for clothing is so complex and so long, probably the most complex and longest supply chains in the world, where we go from the animal, which certainly has to be raised, and those are all kinds of knowledges that you need to do that, but then into the weaving of the product or the tanning of the product, and then the dyeing of it. And then, that's before you ever get to sewing, an article of complex clothes. So that was amazing to me, and how many people around the world possess these skills.
It seems that there is a greater push for both animal welfare and sustainability practices. Were you seeing that as you were getting this book together, just how modern, production of clothing has changed because of this?
Yes, over and over again for every material. As soon as industrialization enters the picture, we find a degradation of the land. We find a degradation of animal welfare. And along with that, we also find that the workers have lives that are more unhealthy. That labor practices, environmental pollution in the labor practices, especially if you think about industrial tanning, which uses incredibly toxic materials, but also those materials go into the watersheds of the places where people live. So yes, it hasn't. Industrialization of our food and of our clothing has had a terrible impact on environmental health, both of animals and of people.
Well, when you're doing your research for this book, was there something that you discovered that is kind of, and there's a lot of information here, but one piece that kind of sticks out
Mm-hmm.
in your mind that was really kind of not a very well-known, um, well-known information in regards to clothing and the progression of it?
Um, in every chapter, I found something like that. I wanted to go back to the second part of your question, your previous question, which I don't think I answered, and that is that everywhere I went, people were trying to find solutions to back up on what we had found didn't work in industrialization and trying to find solutions to that. And most of the pressing problems I found were addressed most directly by the same people who do provide those materials. They're really thinking about it. So for instance, let's take pearls. They're not exactly a clothing, but we found that I found in my research that ornamentation, human ornamentation, the desire to wear something beautiful, to make oneself beautiful, is probably one of the first purposes of clothing, because we human beings developed out of a mild climate. So with pearls, pretty much every place that pearls were plentiful had been stripped by the early 1900s. For instance, in the Americas, the history of colonialism is Spain coming over to the Americas, and one of the things that they were looking for were pearls, gold, of course, but pearls also. If you look at pictures of queens in Europe around that time, they all have like thousands of pearls decorating, sewn onto their dresses. And those pearls, they were expensive. They could sell them and then, of course, fuel the wars in Europe. So Columbus came looking on his third voyage over. He came to looking for pearls, and he came to Venezuela, off the coast of Venezuela, a place called Margarita Island, and found enormous pearl beds, oyster beds. Then those were quickly decimated. I mean, there's stories of the beaches just being piled with broken oyster shells, people just ravenous to find pearls. Then they heard that there were native people on the west coast of Mexico. And so Cortez, when he heard that, he ran across Mexico and went over to the Sea of Cortez, or what we call Baja, the Sea of California. And some of your listeners may know this story from Steinbeck's novel, The Pearl. The plunder of those ancient oyster beds by the Spanish, they raked the bottom of the sea searching for pearls. By 1900, the oysters were wiped out in the Sea of Cortez. 100 years later, 3 graduate students from Guaymas decided that they wanted to start cultivating black-lipped and rainbow-lipped oysters on the eastern shore of the sea. So they introduced spat, which is a baby oyster. Then they carefully tended those oysters, which would, spat likes to be on coral or rock, and also nets. So they would put the nets out. The baby oysters would attach to them. They would bring them up. They would get them bigger and bigger little compartments in the nets to live in. They were protected from any kind of bad weather or predators because they were in these nets. And they started seeding pearl oysters. It's the only sustainable pearl farm in the Americas, and I went to visit it. And now they say that the bay has over 200,000 native oysters. A lot of them not being seeded for oysters. A lot of them wild now because of that pearl farm. And in addition, because it's protected as a pearl farm, all these native species of fish and sea creatures have returned. So it's a great story about people really thinking about how to provide this material, but also how to make the environment healthier.
No, I love that. And thank you so much for taking the time to share that, because it is a journey when you look at just how different, there had been such a destructive application towards harvesting. And then later on, there's, this growth that's happening, and because people really do care about what's happening with the environment and the environment's health.
I think so. And because we don't often think about where our clothing comes from, previously that hasn't been something that we put our attention to. But as we know, our role as consumers is one of the biggest impacts that we can have in making the world a healthier place for not only us, but other species.
There's so much that your book covers, and my goodness, we couldn't go into everything now, but I'd love for you to share a little bit with us in regards to some, the indigenous practices. I know we've been kind of talking about some in regards to silk, and perhaps we can touch on that in regards to wool.
To wool. I didn't visit any indigenous communities vis-a-vis wool, although there are certainly a lot of them. Even in our own country, the Navajo, of course, are famous for their sheep raising and wool raising. However, I would like to go to the question about indigenousness. In the book, I talk about a different kind of thinking, different than our views of capitalism, for instance. And that is the idea of reciprocity. That in over and over, when I read about and when I visited indigenous communities, for instance, the Yupik in southwestern Alaska on the tundra, I learned that people, in order to have a subsistence living, where they subsisted on what is around them, they always had an idea of reciprocity, and that they were being given these materials, and in turn, they would take care of the land and the animals around them. One thing they would do is not waste. That was a big part of reciprocity, that you only took what you needed. Capitalism depends on that we have capital, we have extra, we take more than we need. In the U.S., I have read that not only are we buying more clothes because clothes are cheaper, they're subsidized in lots of ways. For instance, you can buy 3 T-shirts for $10, even though the cotton industry is incredibly. It uses an incredible amount of water and, of course, pesticides. But the idea that, and in America, I've heard that the average person throws away 3 out of the 5 articles of clothing that they buy. So our landfills are full of our clothing. We don't think about it as something that we cherish, and that we and cherishing something is a form of reciprocity also. One of my favorite stories is from the Yupik, where the women who used to spend almost all their time making clothing because it would biodegrade, so it would only be useful for a couple seasons. They would say when we wear our clothing, and they would decorate it beautifully, our beautifully decorated clothing, we wear it out into the world so the animals can see us. And I love that phrase because to me it means so much more than a kind of metaphorical statement. That it means that everybody's affected by what everyone else does. They see us. They see what we do with the clothing. They also see it in their populations, whether they decline or whether they grow. So that was an important concept that I think we would do well to practice.
Well, I think there's so much that can be learned from your book. When you wrote Putting on the Dog, who did you have in mind that the reader would be? Is this a book for everybody?
I had hoped so. I was thinking about how much books like Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma changed the way that people think about their food. People who aren't gardeners, people who aren't in the food industry. And it changed the way that I think about my food and where it comes from and what happens to the animals that I eat before I eat them. It's funny that clothing, which is something essential, as essential as food, unless we live in, the tropics, that we haven't thought about that. So I was thinking about the same kind of reader, someone like me who doesn't know a lot about it, but is interested in the health of the planet and the sustainability of the planet and human and animal life also. So the average reader who is concerned about the life of our earth. Of course, I always wish that maybe the fashion industry would be interested in it. I think people who are working with animals might be interested in it, but mostly the general reader.
Well, I think it's a great book, and I really enjoyed reading it. There's a lot that I personally learned. And I think as a society, to understand where we want to go when we talk about sustainability and animal welfare and the different other things that your books cover, we have to know where we've been. And so there was so much information here. I found it to be so useful. Melissa, where can people connect with you and become part of your community?
One thing they could do if they were interested in this book is to go to the press, which is Trinity University Press, tupress.org. It's a good place to start. And yes.
Go from there. Okay. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was such an honor to spend this time with you, Melissa, and of course to talk about your new book, Putting on the Dog. We are going to pause here for a quick break. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, When you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place, here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
If not me, then who? This ethos is driving the Travis Manion Foundation to empower veterans and families of fallen heroes to develop character in future generations. In 2007, Marine First Lieutenant Travis Manion was killed in Iraq while saving his wounded teammates. Travis's legacy lives on in the 5 words he spoke before leaving for his final deployment. If not me, then who? Guided by this mantra, veterans continue their service, developing strong relationships in the community, and thrive in their post-military lives. Visit TravisManion.org and ensure the character of our nation's heroes lives on in the next generation. If not me, then who?
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. Our next guest today is heather-picken, and she's here to share with us her new book, La Dolce Vita Formula, A Woman's Guide to a Fearless and Fabulous Life. Now, Heather is a human behavior expert and high-performance business strategist for female visionary coaches. She's also a workshop leader and trainer for executives in Fortune 500 companies using neuroscience. Her global mission is to empower millions of women worldwide to live fearlessly as they own their value and worth in mastering all areas of their life. So let's welcome to the show, heather-picken.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
What a pleasure it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I have to ask you, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Wow, that's a great question. My entire life has been about breaking through my fears as a woman, as an entrepreneur. And I wanted to show women that are reading this book is that when you know who you are, like there's a quote in my book, knowing who you are is like having a superpower. And when you find that unique formula that makes you different and that is true to yourself, then you're going to go out there and do amazing things, whether it is in your business, your career, you're going to only align yourself with relationships. On business, a lot of times I find they're not following their formula in the other areas of their life.
Isn't that the truth? A lot of times you'll have everything that looks great, and maybe there's like problems with weight or relationships or you name it. There's always something.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I break it down into just identifying like what is really important to you as a woman. If I could wave a magic wand, what do you really want? And why do you feel that you can't get it? So to me, I deal with the neuroscience and understanding, what really holds women back and how to really break through that. And I have worked with women all around the world, all different industries. And it's really interesting because I find it's not about intellect. It really is about understanding. It goes back to understanding your unique formula, staying true to yourself, and dissolving some of those fears, because the number one thing that holds a woman back from really just going to that next level, like really living her, what I call the Dolce Vita life, which means the sweet life, is fear.
So you touched on this a little bit. I'd love for you to share a little bit with our listeners, the Dolce Vita life or the formula. What exactly is that?
Yeah, and I like to kind of make a joke about it. So I like to pronounce it La Dolce Vita, which means the sweet life in Italian. Yeah. And I actually lived in Italy for a period of time. I actually had the opportunity to study over there and fall in love with the culture. And that's kind of how I came up with the idea of the book, and loved profiling in the book. I have stories of women that I've worked with, and also I profile Italian women. So Italian women, some from history that I felt women could kind of like take a look at and say, wow, if she did it, so can I. So the book, the formula is based on, number one, identifying your unique formula. And this actually goes back to understanding what values are as they apply to what's most important to you. So you uncover the formula of just understanding what makes you tick, like when you're taking action on things that are in alignment, then you're in the flow. But all too often I find women are just, they're living their life for other people. And this is a program that has gone on for many years subconsciously. So we also talk about, once you identify what your highest values are and you live by the hierarchy of your top three, then you also, part of the formula is getting clear on your vision. And so I say, anything that you're not clear on in your vision, you will attract chaos into your life. So it could be in the form of a relationship, business, career. So getting really crystal clear is the secret sauce to aligning yourself with what you want. And then the other part of the formula is breaking through your fear and your limiting beliefs. So there's specific fears that hold people back. So you identify what that fear is. And then I have tools in the book to show you how to transform that fear.
Well, I think it's so important for people to really identify, especially women, to identify their values. And you talk about that. And I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit more, because a lot of times, maybe this could be the first time someone's actually investigating what their values are and why this is important to them.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question, because a lot of times people misconstrue what a value is. So they will say something like, well, I live from integrity. They think that's a value. That's actually a social idealism. So a value is really what is most important to you in your life, and that is demonstrated by the action that you take. So it's not what you say you want to do. It really is about the action. So if we look at the different areas of your life, you've got like your life purpose, your family / relationship. That's a value. Your friends, your finances, your fitness / health, your mindset in your vocation or your career. Now, it's really important to identify what your top three highest values are, because what I find with women, especially if I'm working with a woman in business, if she has a high value on her family and children, not that there's anything wrong with that, and she doesn't have a high value, it's not within her top three of working on a business, then she'll set goals that are unrealistic and she won't hit them. And then therefore she starts beating herself up. So in my book, the La Dolce Vita formula, I talk about, here's how to define what your values are. Here's how to set goals based on what's most important to you. And that way you're not setting up what I call like unicorn goals. And those are fantasy goals that are just not, you're basically looking at someone else's life and you're trying to compare yourself saying, well, I really should set that goal because of so-and-so. So to me, this is really like the recipe to, set goals that make sense to you based on the hierarchy of your values. Now, a couple of different things, like when you scan your life, what's really interesting about this formula, you find that anything that you perceive as a void or missing in your life, like this can stem back from childhood, can become a value. So anything like if you grew up poor, and you really, that really was a, dramatic impact in your life, then that could become a high value in you pursuing something like making money, saving money, and your values can change through like different events. If you have a baby, so if you have a business, all of a sudden you have a baby, that's going to become a high value. So for women, it's understanding how to prioritize things, not feel overwhelmed, not beat yourself up, right? So that you're really being true to yourself. So again, it goes back to knowing who you are is like having a superpower.
Well, that's a great superpower to have. You look at it that way, because too often we get in life and in relationships and working and not really investigating what makes us tick, what makes us want to move forward in life. And so really having these values identified help women to then go and move forward and be really successful.
Exactly. And I do want to highlight this. If you're not following your unique formula that is based on the hierarchy of your top 3 values, what will happen is that you can create dis-ease in your body. We now know science, demonstrates to us that if you're not being true to yourself, you basically activate the sympathetic system in your nervous system. There's the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and the sympathetic is really about triggering that fight or flight. So when you're not being true to yourself, and I've worked with women, it's so interesting when I do a values assessment and I look to see where they're not being true to themselves, they will create things like autoimmune disease in their body or chronic stress or migraines. So when you look at how your body is really a feedback mechanism to your conscious mind to get you to pay attention. And it's interesting because I have worked with women that have had severe migraines, depression, you name it. And then once we basically follow that formula, like this is your formula, this is what you need to follow, then they can get their body back into alignment. And I find this is really important. So if you understand epigenetics and psychoneuroimmunology of how the mind impacts disease, you will definitely look at your life differently, and you'll want to pay attention.
All those things we really need to pay attention to. In your book, you talk about identifying obstacles. So why is it important that we do that?
Oh my gosh. It really is important. Again, I go back to anything you're not clear on, you start creating the chaos, and that could be an obstacle. So, the thing about obstacles, they actually can be a gift for someone, and you want to identify those. So if you have a goal, let's just say, it doesn't matter what area of life that it's in. Let's just say it's a relationship, and you have an obstacle, just looking at your relationship saying, I just don't feel aligned. I don't know about this. It really is there for you to grow. And all too often as women, we can hide out in our fear. We don't want to face it. But the obstacle really is the way. And this goes back to Stoic philosophy. I think Marcus Aurelius, talking about like allowing those obstacles to really be your friend. So when you're faced with an obstacle, you can really transform like the other areas of your life. You can go to the next level. But we've been conditioned in society to think, okay, if there's an obstacle, I just need to drop everything and stop. And I challenge women to look at it through a different lens, because it really is your perception that creates your reality. So when you're looking at an obstacle, it's there, you need to break through that, change the way that you're seeing it, and being able to come up with, I always say, asking yourself empowering questions. What does this really mean? Like, how can I really break through it? Because a lot of times, women, we've been conditioned to go really negative. Oh, why does this always happen to me? Like, why am I facing this obstacle? Instead of understanding that there's always a solution, that your brain can tap into it. But a lot of times we block that out.
Well, isn't that the truth? And it's easy to get into these modes because most of the time that's what women have heard for generations. So, it's like, these things will always happen to you. Maybe you're not dating the right person. You're not in the right work situation. we're kind of bombarded by negativity. So being able to move beyond that is really important.
It's so true, and that has been my life story. So when I'm speaking on stages or on TV or podcast shows, I share my story, how I have been disempowered in every area of my life, from money to men. And I've really made it my mission to show women that there is a better way, and we don't have to buy into the beliefs that we have really just identified, just growing up, because that's where they come from our parents, from the age from 0 to 7. Your brain is like a recording device. So you're picking up all those beliefs like, oh, it has to be hard. And for many years, Marianne, I was so blocked in relationships. Like, I would attract these men that would try to take away my power because they didn't really know who I was. So I would create that reoccurring pattern and theme in my life, and also around money. So I had a belief around money that it had to be hard. And so therefore, everything that I would encounter in my business was a struggle. And I didn't realize until I was doing all this research that it was a program. And this goes back to, and I share this in my book. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in 4th grade. And when I internalized that label, it's so traumatic for a kid, when no one really explains what's going on with your brain, and, that there's nothing wrong with you. So I didn't really know what was going on. What I felt was that I was stupid. So that label of being dyslexic was, I am stupid. So that impacted every single area of my life until I started studying it. So I started reading articles in like Psychology Today about very successful women that have had this. And a lot of times, Marianne, we put labels on ourselves, and labels are lies.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's interesting because when there's not really understanding or language around these different things, and it could be anything with women. I mean, it could be, you talk about, being dyslexic and not really having an understanding of that. And it could be, weight, or like you're talking about money, or, we've been discussing like relationships and, dating and all that, how that all really is the outside factor of what's going on internally. And your book really addresses that very well.
Yeah, it really is. To me, when you look at the subconscious mind and how powerful it is, like if I internalize that label, and I really want your audience to get this, 95% of your beliefs, habits, and behaviors come from your subconscious mind. So if you want to change anything on the outside of your life, it has to start within. So success starts within, in your relationships, in your health and fitness. And, what's interesting is that, I think I talk about this in my book, is that I had a weight issue. So I had everything wrong with me. I was a big mess. Okay, let's just be honest. and I had a weight issue. And so going back to earlier, what I was talking about is like your voids, whatever you perceive as missing through your senses, become a value. So I felt I didn't have the health and vitality that I wanted to. So that actually created a catalyst for me to get into bodybuilding and fitness. So I started competing in fitness competitions. And I will tell you, when I got 3rd place in my first bodybuilding show, that feeling on stage created a trigger in my brain. And that trigger was, if I can do this, I can do anything. And so I really want women to understand that anything that you want, you've got to be obsessed with it mentally. You've got to learn how the brain works and how you can activate your power to reach your highest potential. I have worked with women that have overcome some pretty traumatic and tragic things like molestation, rape, you name it. And it really is about changing their perceptions of those past incidences so that they can no longer have those things take up the real estate in their mind, because that's what it's doing. So I really am about empowering women. Like, don't, like anything that's happened to you in your past, you can use it as fuel. It's just looking at it through a different lens and also being able to create a movement and empowering other women. So I know I've talked a lot about that, but I'm so passionate about, empowering women.
Well, I'm so glad that you are, because your book is a great resource and all the work you do as well. And it has me kind of wondering, I know you mentioned this in your book, you actually kind of dive into it. How can we awaken and discover our unique abilities, and what are those?
Yeah, first off, it all goes back to identifying what your values are. Number one, getting really clear in the areas of life that you are absolutely amazing at. And so one of the questions that you want to ask yourself is, what would I absolutely love to do? Or where am I absolutely amazing? What area of life that I find I'm so unique that no one else has it? Now, I know at first you might be like, no, there's nothing unique about me. But that's a program, right? People might have told you in the past, who are you to do that? But I encourage women to find your Zen place. Mine just happens to be at a coffee shop. I love coffee. I love journaling. And so you go into that space and you start journaling and you start asking your mind empowering questions. Now, this is important because when you ask yourself an empowering question, what is my genius zone? What am I here to do? That activates the frontal lobe, that executive center in your brain, to find the answers. And what happens is if you do this enough, you will get signs, I like to say signs from the universe, those syncing up events that give you the information that you need to connect with. The right people and resources will show up. But what happens is we're so bombarded by negative messages, especially as women, we compare ourselves to everyone else out there, and that just takes us away from our true power. So spend that quiet time, find a place where you can really flesh this out. And I did this for myself, as I was evolving my mission, my business and brand. I'm like, what is it that I can do to get to the next level to empower women? And I thought my unique talent is really about inspiration. And then I took it a step further. Well, how can I get this vehicle out there in a way that's different? And so I came up with a wine label called Fierce Femme Wines. And it's all about creating a dialogue to inspire change for women. And I have a TV show coming out called The Neuroscience of the American Woman. And this is all because I took the time to ask myself, what is it that I'm really here to do in a bigger way to serve women?
Okay. Well, that's lots of great things coming up, and seems like you're really busy with all that. And before we get going here, I have a few more questions. You talk about reprogramming our mindset. How do we become aware of it initially, and how do we reprogram our mindset?
Yeah, well, first off, look at what you want and what that specific block is. So, for example, I'm going to give you a story. I was working with a client, brilliant woman in her business, and she was at a place in her life where the relationship or marriage was not going the way that she wanted it to. And I said, number one, you got to get clear on what you want. And it was hard for her to get clear because she had a belief that she was not worthy and deserving of being in a relationship because of her age. And I said, do you realize that that's just a belief? It's so we dug a little bit deeper and we got to the fear. So I was talking about that earlier. The number one thing that holds women back is fear. So we identified a specific fear that if she left her husband, it's a long story short, he cheated on her. He didn't want to work on the marriage, and she was so scared to leave him because she didn't feel that she would find someone else because of her age. Once we were able to break through that fear, she was able to let go of that relationship that no longer served her in her highest values, which was being in a relationship. And then she was able to transform that to find someone that she's now with in a healthy relationship. So identifying, what is it that you want? What specifically is the fear that's blocking you, and then being able to dissolve that fear. And I go into that in more detail in the book about breaking through those fears.
Yeah, you do cover that. Well, and so when we talk about being a fearless and fabulous female, what is the profile of that?
To me, it's really being true to yourself. I think so often we're living our lives for other people. And to me, being fearless is being the most unique expression and version of who you want to be, like who you really want to be, not what other people want, not what your parents want, not what your partner wants, not what your kids want, but what is really going to inspire you to where you feel like you are living that Dolce Vita life, and I could certainly say today, I'm definitely taking on the fears that are challenging, that feel aligned with my bigger vision, mission, and purpose. And you definitely want to have that. But yeah, the bottom line is knowing what you want, knowing who you are, and going after it and realizing like on this journey of life, you're definitely going to have challenges. So you have to be able to balance your mind as you break through each one. And you'll always have fear. After interviewing over 500 successful women, executives, and leaders, they still have fear. So it'll never go away. It'll just transform to the next level.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you also talk about the power of gratitude in your book. What is that and how does that benefit us?
I love that question. Yeah, gratitude is really important because when you are grateful for something, and it sounds so simple, and I know people have heard this before, but they've actually done studies that when you are in gratitude, your brain actually grows, okay? When you're actually the opposite, when you're not thankful for the things that you have, your brain actually shrinks. And then this goes back to activating dis-ease in your body, not loving yourself. Love actually is the highest vibration. So when you're in gratitude, when you're thankful for simple things, and I do a practice every single day of what I'm truly grateful for. So I would pick 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for. And what happens is that I find when you're focused, when your thoughts and feelings are focused in gratitude, you open up the space to attract and align bigger things. And if you don't believe me, do it for 30 days and watch what happens.
Well, it sounds like the perfect way to go ahead and jumpstart your day. Heather, where can people connect with you and be part of your community?
Yeah, I'm all over social media, but the best way to connect with me is to go to heather-picken.com. I've got a free training there about, it's called the Deep Dive Visionary Formula. And they can also go to, if you want a copy of my book, you can go to fearlessandfabulousbook.com.
Perfect. Well, Heather, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
It was my pleasure, Marianne. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Heather. It's been such a joy to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, La Dolce Vita Formula, A Woman's Guide to a Fearless and Fabulous Life. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.